So what I'm going to be doing is actually talking about specifically SharePoint Online and PowerShell. So using the SharePoint management shell, online management shell, CSOM, REST, and some custom commandlets that I've created. If you are interested in learning how to create custom commandlets, I do have an article. Where is it? Sorry, I guess I closed it. But if you go to Cybex, and actually, shoot. Forgot to plug my network cable in. So that would help. But if you go to Cybex, my book that I wrote on PowerShell has a chapter that's downloadable that tells you how to create custom commandlets for on-prem. And on IT Unity, there's going to be an article coming up that talks about how to create custom commandlets based on CSOM that allow you to work against on-prem and SharePoint Online. So if you are interested in that, there is some material out there. All right, so like I said, this session is going to be working with SharePoint Online specifically. So I think in the abstract I say Office 365, but I'm really just going to be focusing exclusively on SharePoint Online. A lot of the principles, though, that I'll be covering do relate to the other set of services. So if you look at like the MSOL commandlets that are available for administering your users and your tenant holistically, Exchange Online, that kind of stuff. As well as some of the new services and APIs that are coming out. Hopefully this will kind of give you a baseline as far as just some of the things to think about and things you need to know, and then you should be able to apply that to those other technologies. So my name is Gary Lapointe. I'm a co-owner of Aptalon. It's just a small consulting company out in the States. A 7-time MVP. My blog's not been very active lately. Most of my writing these days I'm actually doing on IT Unity. So I've got a series of articles that I've been writing that actually kind of follow this presentation a little bit. So really just kind of hydrate in the PowerShell channel that we're trying to set up on IT Unity. So hopefully we'll be creating a lot more new articles on more emergent stuff that's coming out. But right now I'm trying to sort of backfill and get some baseline knowledge up there. I am on Twitter, though I don't use it very often. It's mostly hockey stuff that I'll tweet or my articles that I'm posting. And if you have any questions, definitely follow up with me on my email. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. All right, the agenda. I'm going to hit upon each of these 4 topics very briefly, the last one really briefly. I want to give you just a quick overview of the SharePoint Online Management Shell, walk through a couple examples using some of the commandlets that it exposes, and then we'll jump into using CSOM and REST with PowerShell. These are basically just going to be 2 different ways that we can reach beyond what the management shell can provide. So that management shell is going to take us within a certain scope, but we want to be able to dig deeper into that. CSOM and REST are 2 different ways that we can accomplish that. So basically drilling down into the webs and lists, libraries, that kind of stuff. And then I have a series of custom commandlets that I've created that make doing CSOM and REST and whatnot a lot easier. Okay, to get started with the SharePoint Online Management Shell, it is a separate download. You can get it from the link there. Just search for SharePoint Online Management Shell. You'll find it. And it allows you to run these commandlets from any host machine. You don't need to be on a SharePoint on-prem machine or anything like that. You can put it on any machine as long as it has at least PowerShell v3. It should be kind of v4 or v5. It'll work with either. But v2 you'd need to upgrade, and at least .NET 4. And then once you install it, it's going to create a shortcut to the SharePoint Online Management Shell. So if you're on Windows 7, like I still am, it's going to be Start All Programs, SharePoint Online Management Shell. Windows 8, just go to your Start menu, you find it. You can ignore it. You don't need it. All it does is it explicitly loads the SharePoint Online PowerShell module for you. But with PowerShell v3, you don't need to explicitly load those modules. They will be automatically loaded for you when you actually try to execute a commandlet. So if we look at the shortcut for the management shell, all it's doing is opening up a PowerShell executable, so PowerShell console, and then passing in the import module command. That disable name checking parameter that it adds at the end just tells PowerShell to ignore any unapproved verbs. So there's a couple verbs that they use within, actually I think maybe just one, I think it's the upgrade one, that they use in the SharePoint Online PowerShell commandlets that they shouldn't be using. They're not approved. So disable name checking just prevents you from getting a nice little yellow warning when you load it. Like I said, it can be manually loaded. You can either explicitly use the import module commandlet to load the commandlets that are available as part of it. Or again, if you're using PowerShell v3, it's just going to be automatically loaded. Which, of course, you have to use PowerShell v3. Was anybody in my talk yesterday? A few of you? Okay, so I mentioned something about setting up your profile, and with SharePoint 2010 on-prem, you had to make sure that the threading model was set correctly, otherwise you could run into some disposal issues. You don't need to worry about that with SharePoint Online. The commandlets and the objects that those commandlets expose do not require any form of object disposal. There's no real risk of memory leak there. The objects that we get are going to be basically just real simple data wrappers. All right, so in terms of getting connected, before you can actually work with any of the commandlets, you need to establish a connection to your tenant. And it's not a specific site collection or anything. You're going to connect to your tenant. Once you've established that connection, then you can start using the commandlets. And to do that, you're going to use the connect SPO service commandlet. And again, you have to use your tenant admin site. So here we're just going to call connect SPO service, pass in the URL of our admin site. So notice the -admin on there, and then our credentials. So I could leave that credentials parameter off. That's optional. And what will happen is it'll just prompt me to enter credentials. So here I'm just pre-filling it with at least the username. So when it prompts me, all I have to do is type the password. Once you're done working with the commandlets, you want to disconnect from the service. Most of the time when you're done working with the commandlets, you're just going to kill your PowerShell window, and that's it. So you don't really need to disconnect. Behind the scenes, what's happening when you call that connect SPO service, it's creating a SharePoint Online credential object and just sticking that in a static variable behind the scenes. So there's really no live connection. All it does really is just validate that you can authenticate to the tenant and that you have rights to operate against it. Once it gets a token as a result of that SharePoint Online credential object effectively will store a cookie and some token information. That just goes into this little static variable. So each time I make a subsequent call, so if I go to get the list of site collections, it's going to use that token as part of the request. When I call disconnect SPO service, all it's doing is setting that static variable to null. So again, that's just an internal thing you'll never see, but behind the scenes, that's all that's happening. So closing out your window, you're fine. You don't really need to ever run this. I like to run it in scripts though. So if I got a script that establishes a connection, at the end I want to make sure, I'll basically have a try finally, and in that finally I'll put my disconnect. Because I want to make sure, because that is a static global, local to the process, if somebody comes behind me and does something, that guy's still in memory. Right? There's nothing specific to the commandlets there. It's a static variable that's isolated to the PowerShell process. So if you got a script that you ran and you provided your credentials and you leave that open and another script runs, it can hijack those credentials. So again, it's just best practice to make sure you shut that down after you're done. So actually, let me just show you that. So here I'm just on my local machine. I don't have SharePoint installed on this at all. It's just a Windows 7 machine. I'm going to get a credential to my tenant, and I'm just in the integrated scripted environment here. I'm going to just run that selection, provide my password. And so all that does is just give me a credential object. Let me change that view there. And now I'm going to go ahead and connect to my tenant. And this will just take a second. It's going out and doing that negotiation, and I should be connected now. One thing I want to show you, though, before I actually do anything with that is this is just a plain old PowerShell window. I don't have anything loaded, no modules or anything like that. But if I just go ahead here and type connect SPO service, and at the complete type and hitting tab, it sees that it's already available. Because what happens is PowerShell's smart enough to know I've got a module in this particular location, so at least give me the list of commandlet names. Now, technically, the assemblies and everything related to these commandlets are not yet loaded, but PowerShell knows that it has a commandlet by this name in this location, so it can give me my tab completion and whatnot. And once I use it, so I'm just going to hit enter here and not actually provide any values, I'm just going to Control-C that. Because I actually executed that commandlet, it went and automatically loaded that module for me. So now those assemblies are actually in memory just by hitting enter on that command. So I don't actually have to go to the SharePoint Online Management shell. I think I've maybe gone into there twice just to check a couple of things. But for the most part, I work either in my ISE or a command prompt. Okay. So now that I've established a connection, I can start using the commandlets, and it's pretty much that simple. So let's go and look at the commandlets that are available to us. When we're on-prem, all of our commandlets are going to be noun-sp verb, right? So they're all going to start with that sp abbreviation first. With the SharePoint Online commandlets, it's just simply SPO. And we're going to have reasonable overlap in terms of the number of commandlets that are the same, but you'll see there's not many. If you want to see the list of commandlets that are available, you can use the get commandlet and just pass in the module name. There's only 30 of them. So contrast this with on-prem, where I get somewhere around 800 commandlets. My own custom commandlets, I have 45 of them that I've provided for SharePoint Online. I have 100 and something for the on-prem version, right? So when we start looking at SharePoint Online and PowerShell, what we can do with commandlets, we're pretty limited. Most of those commandlets are going to be related to working with site collections, so provisioning site collections, deleting them, working with users and groups, and a little bit on the app management side. I mentioned this earlier, but all the objects that I get back, so if I call get SPO site, which is one of the commandlets I'll show, it's going to return back a data object. There are no useful methods, properties, setters on those or anything. So all it is I've got an URL, I got a title, here's my web template, all that kind of stuff. But I can't do anything to that object. It's just there for basically informational purposes. Some of those properties are going to have setters on them, and I'll show you this in a minute as well. You can set them, the value if you want there, but it's not going to do anything. There's no way to actually push that back to the server. So you have to use the equivalent commandlet to actually update those changes. So these are going to be probably the most commonly used commandlets. So if we look at kind of starting on the right side there, site collections, if you think about your provisioning process and whatnot, I'm going to check to see if a site collection exists. If it doesn't, I'm going to go ahead and create that site collection. Over time, I'll eventually remove it, and then somebody might decide, okay, we didn't want it removed, so we're going to recover it and whatnot. The set SPO site gives me the ability to change a couple of properties on it. Test and repair, these are going to be related to health check rules. So if you're familiar with on-prem and you go into Central Admin, you get a variety of health check rules that are going to run against your environment. Some of those rules are specific to site collections. We have all those same rules on SharePoint Online, and when a rule runs, and you can trigger those rules to run using this test SPO site against your site collection, some of those rules have the ability to automatically repair the issue that comes up. That's the repair SPO site collection. And then if you're doing upgrades, so this would probably be relevant once, it was more relevant, I guess, when we were going from the 2010 version of Office 365 to the 2013, but the way they're doing upgrades now with Office 365, this might not be relevant again for a long time because they're doing more incrementals. They're already on 2016, right? So they went from 2010 to 2013 and then silently to 2016. So whether or not upgrade SPO site is going to be relevant in the future, who knows? Is there anybody that still has 2010 sites in Office 365? Yeah, so they've all basically been upgraded. And then you can get into security management. One thing I find funny is they have a new SPO site group, get SPO site group. So they have these for online, but they don't actually have them for on-prem. So there's no way, at least using Commandlets, to work with groups. You have to actually know the API to do it. We do have users on-prem, and they've got the equivalent Commandlets there. And then these are going to be the less likely to be used, at least with the exception of the connect SPO service, obviously, because you need to use that every time you connect. But these commandlets just don't provide a whole lot of information, honestly. When I first saw the apps ones, I was thinking, oh, that's fantastic, get SP app info. Maybe it'll give me the list of all the apps installed in my site collection, and I can pull all that back, maybe see the errors or whatever. It doesn't do that. You need to know the product ID of the app. I think there's another value you can use, but for the most part, it's the product ID. So you basically have to know that the app is installed in the tenant, in that site collection, in order to get the information about it. And the information that comes back is virtually useless. So what I'd love for them to create is a get SPO app commandlet that just returns back all the apps in my site collection so I can iterate them and do some governance and automation around those so I can see where is this app deployed within my tenant. Right now there's nothing available for that. But you could create it. All right, so I'm just going to go through just two quick examples of using these site collections. Specifically, we'll look at the retrieval process of getting a site collection and then creating a site collection. All the other commandlets follow the same kind of pattern. So if you're familiar with at least the issues of these two scenarios, the others are pretty much the same. It's just different parameters, different context. So if we want to retrieve one or more site collections, we can use the get SPO site commandlet. And like the on-prem version, it has a limit all parameter, or a limit parameter, where you can specify how many that you want to return back. By default, I believe it was just 20. I forget, because most of the time I end up just slapping in that limit all attribute to bring everything back. Because usually when I'm doing something, I explicitly want to iterate over all the site collections. So getting 20 back is useless to me. So if you don't provide an URL, it's going to obviously bring back multiple items. If you provide us an explicit URL, then it's going to bring back just that single item, just like the on-prem version. What's different with on-prem, though, is we have this detailed parameter. By default, it's going to send you just some core information, and I'll show you what that information is in a minute here. But almost all of the time, if you're trying to work with a site collection, you're going to want to add that detailed parameter. If all you're trying to do is just give me a list of site collections so that I can actually dig deeper and do something else with them, like add users or whatever, then you don't need to bother with the detailed parameter. But from an auditing or governance standpoint, if you're trying to get some core information about it, you're probably going to want that there. Something as simple as what web template is installed on here. If I don't provide detailed, I don't see that information. You can do some filtering, but it's pretty limited, and I haven't checked a while, but last time I did check, there was no documentation as to what properties you could actually filter on, but there's only like 10 of them, so you could probably go through and trial and error that. I typically haven't needed to even bother using this filter parameter, so I haven't taken the 5 minutes just to go and do that check. But again, this is very similar to on-prem. So we have a filter parameter with the get SP site commandlet on-prem. And like that commandlet, we pass in something that looks very much like a where filter, where object filter in PowerShell. The object that you get back when you call get SPO site is an SPO site object, or specifically a Microsoft.online.SharePoint.client.SPO site. That object has no methods. You can't do anything with it. So you can view the properties. There are setters, like I said, but if you set the value, it's not going to get applied anywhere. You can't make any changes. So if you need to make changes to the SPO site object, to your site collection, you would use the set SPO site commandlet. And I kind of list out the parameters, the properties that you can set there. It's not everything. So there's just a small subset of the kinds of things that you can do versus what you could do with the API directly. And I think most importantly, there's no way to iterate over child objects. So I can get the site collection, that's great, but I'd really love to know what's going on with my webs, my subsites in there. I'd like to get access to a particular list. I can't do that with any of the commandlets or any of the objects that are returned by these commandlets. I have to go and use something like CSOM or REST to get that information. So before I do the create, let's actually look at this here. So I've already established a connection to the tenant. So now I want to go ahead and just get a particular site, and let's execute this. Let's actually clear this, execute that. So this is going to give me a specific SPO site object, and so you can see that. All right, so this is the data that comes back. Obviously, this wasn't last modified, 2014 years ago, right? So you can see that's just one example of a value that's not coming back. But if I were to run this again with the detailed parameter, you can see I get some more data there. Now this is kind of hard to see the differences, so I kind of pre-filled this in Notepad++ with the comparison plugin they've got there, so you can see some of the changes. So basically everything highlighted there has been changed. So the left side is without the detailed parameter, the right side is with. So things such as allow self-service upgrade, the template that I'm using, by default they pick EHS-1, which is the SharePoint Online team site. But that's not actually what it is. It's actually STS-0. So not only do they give you, kind of null values in some cases, but in some cases they give you incorrect default values. So I would have much rather seen a null value for that. Because if you're not paying attention to whether or not you had the detail in there, you might think that, oh, this is actually a Office 365 team site template. So again, be mindful of that detailed parameter because it does make a difference depending on what you're doing. All right. Again, it depends on what you're looking for. So if all you're trying to do is iterate over the site collections so that you can do something else, like get deeper, like you just want to add a user or whatever, I don't really care what the permissions are. I just need that URL to the site collection.
Is there a cost to call that detailed parameter?
It's minor because on the server side, I mean, they're basically using the same code that on-prem uses, right? So if you look at how they actually build the CSOM API, so behind the scenes, the SharePoint Online Commandlets are actually using CSOM to connect. So all it's doing is making a request out, and behind the scenes on the server, it's still calling the same code that we would use on-prem to get an object back. So in terms of processing on the server, minimal. Unless they're doing some optimization that they haven't talked about publicly on there, there should be no benefit server side. So it's all about bandwidth, how much your data you're pulling down. Because they're defaulting so many values, there's really no cost savings, in my opinion at least, or it's very minor in terms of what am I saving from that bandwidth, because I'm still bringing a value down, it's just the wrong one. So for me, the savings is if I just need the URL, it's one less parameter for me to type. So for me, it's like 2 keystrokes, or 1, maybe 3 or whatever. So that's my savings. All right. So let's look at creating a site collection. Actually, one more thing here. Sorry. Okay, yeah. All right, so to create a site collection, just like on-prem, you have a new SB site commandlet. Online, it's new SPO site. There's a couple minor differences. With on-prem, I don't have to provide a time zone or a storage quota. With online, I do. These are required properties. And what's interesting is the storage quota, there's a minimal value. Like I have 100 there, but that actually wouldn't work. I think they keep bumping it up. It used to be 50, then it was 100, now I think it's like 110 or something like that. So the minimum storage quota that you can provide kind of keeps growing. I think it's to force people to buy more space. But But anyways, you can see it's pretty basic. You're going to pass in the owner parameter, your template that you're going to use. And if you need to get a list of templates, I think I've got that here. Yeah, there's a get SPO web template commandlet that you would run to see which templates are installed. It's not going to be necessarily the same templates that you have on-prem. It's a subset, and there's actually a couple that they've added. So don't assume that because I have it on-prem that I'll have it online.
Do they have a list of time zone IDs on MSDN somewhere?
I believe so, yeah. Honestly, most of the time when I need to look it up, it's quicker for me to go, if I were to do it in the browser, go like I'm going to create a new time zone, find that little drop down, hit F12 into the developer toolbars, and just see what the value is. So, but you could probably just as quickly do a Google search and find it. Yeah, so 10 is mountain time zone. So I live out in Colorado, which is a mountain time zone. Another thing, because this is basically using CSOM behind the scenes, by default what it wants to do is return back immediately. It's an asynchronous call. So what they've done with the new SPO site commandlet is they've changed it to implement a polling mechanism. So if you don't provide the no wait parameter, behind the scenes it's going to poll the service, your tenant, I think every 5 seconds maybe. It might be more frequently than that, I forget now. But anyways, it's just going to go check, are you done, are you done, are you done? And then when it's done, it'll return back. If you don't want it to wait, so just fire that commandlet off, fire and forget, move on to the next one, which is really helpful. Like if you've got a bunch of site collections that you just want to provision, you don't want your script to have to wait for them to be done necessarily. There are many cases where you do want it to wait, especially if you're actually planning on making configuration changes after that guy is completed. But you can just provide that no wait parameter and it'll just come back right away. And actually, let's look at the templates that are available. So if I come in here.
Do you know how often they've changed the minimum storage code so far?
I don't know. I just, every once in a while, I go in and check, and it's, okay, I guess I need to use another higher value. So if we look at the web templates that are available, we can see it's a smaller number than what we have with on-prem. And that EHS one is, like I said, what was used by default. This is a team site, so it's really just STS-0, but they've added a couple things. So it's a SharePoint Online specific version of it. So let's go ahead, and I'm not going to actually create the site because this takes about 5 minutes or so for it to run, so we don't want to wait for it. So I've already created a site, and basically I just ran this command here. So I just created one under sites evoconf, and again you can see I basically provided the same parameters that I had in that slide there. And if I were to execute this, it would go ahead and return that back and set that to a variable. So now I can dump that out and see what we've got. So, and again, I didn't do that with the detailed parameter, but you can see that that guy does exist now. Okay. I don't have slides for this, but I'll show it really quick. And actually, let's just look at the that site. So this is the site that it created, and I went and added just a couple documents into the library. I'm just going to refresh this real quick. So there's a couple documents in there just for a later demo, but this is the site that was created. You can see it's just basically a simple team site. But one of the things that you'll often want to do is come into your site settings and people and groups, and you're going to want to add new groups and users and whatnot. So in terms of your governance and how you want to set these up, a lot of people and a lot of my clients, what they'll do is have a sort of standard template. So they might have a private department collaboration team site, something where HR goes and they do all their collaboration in this one site collection, related to HR in general. And then we might have other team sites specific to projects. So if they've got a project related to their employee handbook, they might have a team site just for that or whatever, right? So there's all kinds of different team sites, different templates, different needs. So what we typically do is we'll set up a PowerShell script that when they need a new site collection, we've done this a couple different ways. One is just they put a ticket in and somebody goes and runs a script. Another is that we'll have a list set up, and I'll have a timer, a scheduled task that monitors that list, again using CSOM. And it'll just run this code to go ahead and provision that site collection for us, and then it'll go and add lists, web parts, all that stuff that's needed to configure it. As part of that, we'll often also configure security. So one client maybe doesn't actually want anybody in the owners group for certain types of site collections. So they want them to do everything except manage permissions. So we set up some different groups, different roles and that kind of stuff. But just to show you just a simple example of what you can do with the SharePoint Online commandlets here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new group. I'm just going to call it designers and give it the permission design and edit. So if I run that, let me put this back to here. Through CSOM, you can. CSOM and REST, you can get the property bags, and but not through the SharePoint Online commandlets. So now I've got a group. So if I refresh this, I should see that I have a designers group in here now. Right here. Oops. Sorry. Wrong one. So right here, and there's nobody in it. So I want to go ahead now and add a user. So I'm going to add my daughter into that group. It'll just take a second to run. And if we refresh that now, we can see we have a user in there. So if we look at those commandlets again, it's pretty straightforward. You know, what site, so I got that in a variable up here. So this just gives me the ability to pass that into other commandlets. And really it's just taking the URL from that object and using that. The group name and my permission levels. And this is just a comma separated string of the base permission levels that you can provide. And then to add the user, again, site, the group that I just created. In this case, I can't pass in the group object. I actually need the login name, which is just designers. There's an earlier version of the commandlets that did allow me to actually pass in the group, and then they changed it. And then the login name of the user that I want to add. And then I'm not going to run these because I want to use this site later, but if I need to remove the site collection, I can just run this commandlet here and either pass in the URL or that SPO site object. This doesn't actually delete it. It puts it into the recycle bin, and I can get it back by doing get SPO deleted site. This just returns back which sites are deleted. It doesn't do the restore. Restore would actually be the one that brings it back. So if you want to permanently delete something, though, it's actually a two-step process. You use remove SPO site and then remove SPO deleted site. So that would actually permanently delete it. It'll give you, if you do the remove SPO site and then you try to create a new one, it's in the recycle bin, it'll give you an error saying that it already exists. Yeah. Okay, and like I said, there's no ability to create or otherwise manage subsites. Okay, so that's the SharePoint Online Management Shell. That allows us to work with users, site collections in general. But once I want to get anywhere below there, I'm stuck. Now I got to switch technologies. I got to use CSOM or REST to do that. So I'm going to walk through some basics on CSOM. Is there anybody here? How many of you are developers and have you worked with CSOM already? Okay, most of you, good. So this should be just really quick primer. You'll see that working with CSOM in PowerShell, almost identical to in C#. You really just got to get over the syntactical differences with PowerShell. And then there's one big difference related to Lambda expressions, which I'll talk about. So CSOM, Microsoft SharePoint Client-Side Object Model. This basically just allows us to work remotely. Now I'm going to show this using working against Office 365 explicitly, but you can also do it with on your on-prem environment. So you could write code that targets either environment. My custom commandlets that I have target either environment. The only difference is how you authenticate. You're either going to use a SharePoint Online credential object or a network credential object. That's about it. These are, again, managed.NET objects. They have objects for most of the common elements. So they've got a list object that would correspond to an SP list object, a site object that would correspond to an SP site, web, SP web. So oddly, they basically just took all the, in terms of a naming convention, they took the SP off of all their object names. So again, instead of SP list, it's list. when you're working with certain types of APIs like REST, it's difficult to know what operations you have. So do I have the ability to delete? What properties are going to come back? With CSOM, because it's a fully typed API, I can look at the object and see, okay, I've got these properties, these methods, this is what I can do. So ultimately, it's pretty cut and dry as far as what your options are. So there's no guesswork there. And it does support batching of queries. So I can chain a whole mess of operations together and then execute that as a single batch against the server, so reducing your bandwidth and the number of calls. And there is a lot of relatively undocumented throttling going on Office 365. So if you do a lot of this stuff, like maybe you're writing something to migrate your content up to Office 365, you might run into the case where you've been throttled, where your operations will no longer succeed. So you got to figure out how often to reestablish a connection, how often to basically run your execute query method so that you're not going to get throttled, and you can put as many in those batches as possible. So to get this going, you need to load at least 2 core required assemblies. These will get you most of the basic operations you need to operate on a standard SharePoint site. There are several other assemblies that you can load that will enable you to get access to things like publishing features, the managed term store, search, that kind of stuff. But if you're really just working against basic site, web, list, these are typically all that you would need. Now in PowerShell, to load these, you're going to use the system.reflection.assembly load file static method and just pass in the path to the files. And where do you get those files? There's 3 places. If you have an on-prem environment, you can just copy from there. Just copy them up to your local machine or whatever, and you can load them from there, and they're going to be in your 15 Hive ISAPI folder. If you have a management shell installed, they will be installed into the GAC for you, and they're also in the file system. So you can use a different load method if you want to pull them from the GAC, or again, you can just reference them from the install folder. I would probably actually just go and get the client components SDK though, and the reason for that is, unlike the management shell and your local on-prem install, if I install the client components redistributable, it gives me 2 different folders. So what it does is it creates a folder structure just like your on-prem environment. So I have that program files, common files, Microsoft Shared Web Server Extensions, 16 and 15 ISAPI folders. If you're going against SharePoint Online, the DLLs here in this ISAPI folder, the 16 ISAPI folder, are more up to date. So there's things in there that are specific to SharePoint Online. If you're going to on-prem, you would use these. So again, it just depends on what your target is. Both of them will work just fine against SharePoint Online, but if you're looking for maybe some properties or capability that just hasn't been exposed yet to 2013, then you'd want to go and just use the assemblies in this folder. So, and you can see there's a lot more of them, right? So,
if I'm writing code for both environments, is there a specific property that I can check it's an online or?
Well, if you're going to both environments, you're going to authenticate differently. So you kind of need to ask the user, where are you going? So I would just put a conditional in so I'd probably have a prereq script that handles the authentication and the loading of the assemblies. And that way I can do both in the same place. So, but again, if you are looking for that newer functionality, then you probably have additional like conditionals later. So if you don't care about the new stuff, you're doing basic level, list operations, that kind of stuff, I would just use the 15 assemblies. Most of the time, that's all I do. So, and again, if you're in SharePoint Online, so if in the management shell, those assemblies are loaded automatically for you. So if you load that, if you run the import module commandlet, and actually, I don't think you even have to execute a commandlet. I'm pretty sure just running the import module commandlet will actually trigger those assemblies to be loaded into memory. So, okay. And like I said, there are additional assemblies available for other things. So in terms of how we get connected, you want to start off, get a credential object. You don't actually have to do this. You can hard code your username and password. I wouldn't do that. But using this technique at least just allows you to prompt for a username and password so you're not having to store that in clear text anywhere. And then once you've done that, you're going to create a new Microsoft SharePoint client, SharePoint Online Credentials object. And you're just passing in the username and the password as a secure string. So if you don't use the credential object, you'll have to use the convert-to secure string commandlet to take a clear text password and convert it. There's also ways that you can embed an encrypted password in there. But if you can do that, I can still find out what your password is. So I always prompt for a password. So once you've got your credential object, and I just store that in a variable somewhere. Usually with my scripts, I'll store it in a global variable. And I'll show you that so that as I'm making subsequent calls, I don't have to keep prompting for credentials every time. You then need to just create a new context. So you're going to create a Microsoft SharePoint client context object, and pass in the URL of the site collection that you want to connect to. So this will be whatever site collection you're connected to. And that just gives back a context object. And that's it, you're connected. Actually, sorry, established once you provide the credentials to that object, then you're connected. Sorry. So there's no like execute or anything you need to do. That establishes the connection. And just like with the online shell, the management shell, it's not a live connection. It went out, got a token, stored it locally in a variable. So here's an example of running that. Let me actually just show you the live example. And this is a function that I created just as a kind of quick demo to show you what it, how you can kind of abstract this behavior out just once. So I created something called just connect CSOM. Give me the URL, give me the username, and then here I'm going to go ahead and just load the assemblies that I need. And then I go and see, okay, if I have a credential object stored in the global scope, then great. If not, go ahead and prompt the user and set all that up. And then I create my context object. All this does is check to make sure that that context object was created successfully. So, and then that's it. And then when I come down to actually using it now, here I'm just going to load that script into memory. And then this is how I could call it and get back an actual context. So again, that context object is not much going on there. If I look at that, it gives me a little bit of details about it, but this is my entry point into everything else. So I have a site object, a web object, and I can start drilling down and getting those details. So from the web object, I can get into the list and whatnot. The trick here is that when you work against these objects here, again, it's given me this object, but if I say, okay, I want to see the web object associated with that, I'm going to get an error because the collection hasn't been initialized. So just because I have the object doesn't mean that everything is there that I need. So I have to tell it to go ahead and get that information. So here I'm going to say, let's see, actually, if I try to load just a specific property, I get nothing back, right? So I'm going to go ahead and tell it, go ahead and load that, that web object. So populate it with data and execute that. Yeah, it's context. Oh, sorry. I need to set my variable. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead, let's clear that, load that. Now this hasn't actually done anything yet. It's just batched an operation. It said, okay, this object's going to need to be populated, put it in the queue. Nothing happens until I run this execute query. And now that I've done that, and actually let's pop open Fiddler. We'll run this guy. And we can see here, it's doing a bunch of login, authentication stuff. And down here at the end, this is the data that comes back. So let's look at the raw results. Right, so we can see this is my web object that comes back. So now if I come in here and do web.url I can see the actual role, right? So just because the object's there doesn't mean you have it. Now what's interesting is, so, oops, too many control Z's. All right, so if I do web again, so I've loaded that object, right? So now I should be able to see all those properties. You know, what gives? I thought I just initialized it. You initialized the core property, but there's collection objects that are part of that that didn't get initialized. You have to explicitly initialize those. This reason here is why I created my custom commandlets, because it's a pain in the butt trying to figure out what's available, what's not available. So if you're working with CSOM and PowerShell alone, you end up actually having something like Fiddler open all the time so you can see, okay, I loaded it, but what's actually available? So, skip ahead here. Okay. Actually, let me show you a couple other things really quick. If I want to come in now and do something like create a list, if you go to MSDN, there's a whole mess of examples out there on how to work with CSOM. This is an example of one of those that they have. So here's the C# equivalent of how to create a list. So if you were to go to this MSDN article here, you'll see this up there, right? So how do you translate that into PowerShell? Same kind of thing. You're going to get the context, you set your web object, and I'm going to create a creation info, list creation info object, and set some properties of that, my title, my template, and then I'm going to call the web.list.add. Now this didn't actually add it to the list yet, but this triggers the operation in the queue, and then after it's created, I want to set the description, update it, save that description. And then this is what finally does all the operations there. So this is where the actual creation occurs, is when I run that execute query method. So you can see syntactically, it's very similar to how I would do it in C#. It's just adding in the PowerShell nuances. So things like my template type, well, the way I operate with enums here is a little different. So I get my type, ::, that gives me access to the enum value, and then I cast it to an int. Okay.
Is error handling any different?
Generally the same. Yeah, you have your try-catch finalies in PowerShell and whatnot. So the question was related to error handling. It's going to be roughly the same in PowerShell. So, what's different is everybody here familiar with Lambda expressions in CSOM? Okay, so just really quick example. So if I'm in PowerShell, C# and I have a web object called web, right? And I want to get the list. I want to say, give me all the lists where the title is equal to, I don't know, test, right? That's basically a Lambda expression. With CSOM, where you see this most is I want to do something like context load, and I've got a list object, right? Or a collection, yeah, a list object. So I've taken the web.list collection, so I could do web.list. That might make more sense. And here I want to actually go and say, give me all of the titles for that list. So I can actually create a Lambda expression here that says title. So this is going to say, for all those lists, I'm just interested in the title property. Don't load all the other things, right? I have no equivalent to that in PowerShell. I can't do Lambda expressions. So what you end up having to do is actually, if you were to reverse engineer, so basically reflect a Lambda expression, you'll see that you can actually do it with .NET 2 code. It's just a whole mess of generic expressions and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So anyways, if I want to do that in PowerShell, here's an example function that replicates that behavior. So I can call this function, I called it load CSOM properties, and I just pass in some values, and you'll see it's a bit of a nightmare, right? It's not something you're just gonna go ahead and write. I've documented this up on IT Unity, so I've got some blog posts that have come out recently on using CSOM with PowerShell. This function and how and why you might use it is there, so you can download that and take a look at it. So, okay, I already talked about that. Okay, so this is my this is that function. It's just intentionally making it, showing that it's a lot of code. You're not supposed to be able to read it from there. So on this line, okay. So moving on to REST. Everybody here familiar with REST? Or anyone not familiar with it? Okay, there's a few sessions here that are going to be covering it. I'm going to blow through this pretty quick. It's the short and simple of it is REST allows me to perform operations against my SharePoint environment using URLs. So I can construct an URL and use HTTP verbs, get, delete, post, merge, update, well, not update, but anyways, to go ahead and actually perform some task, get some data or whatever. REST stands for representational state transfer. Again, it uses verbs to actually perform those operations against a web service endpoint. The data that comes back can be in either JSON or XML. If you're doing client-side browser-type development, JSON is definitely preferred. If you're on PowerShell, I still like JSON. XML, though, is pretty easy to work with in PowerShell, so it's really just kind of what makes you feel better. For me, JSON, it's a smaller payload coming down. It's pretty easy to read. Like when I'm looking in Fiddler and whatnot, it's pretty clear. And there's a nice little commandlet called convert from JSON or something like that, which I'll show you in a second, that will take a JSON object and convert it to a PowerShell object. There was batching that was recently introduced to this. If you go to Andrew Connell's session later today, he's going to be discussing this, so I don't cover it here. It's a pretty big topic, but you can actually utilize batching with REST. REST basically uses an OData standard, an OData syntax. Again, we're going to use HTTP verbs, so get, post, put, merge, delete, for create, read, update, and delete operations. Most of the time, you're just going to use get and post, and then there's another header value that you'll set to achieve the delete and merge and put verbs. If you have methods, so you want to get a list by a title, there's going to be navigator operations on that. And I'll show you some of that. So when you look at these URLs, there's three kind of key parts. You've got your service root URI. So in SharePoint world, this is going to be everything up to here, your underscore API. That maps to client.svc, which is what we had in 2010. And it's still there in 2013, but you're not really supposed to be using that directly. And then everything after that, the resource path. So I want a web. And then within that web, I want information about a list. And you just kind of keep drilling down with those resource paths. And then I can add some query options. So you can do some filtering, sorting, that kind of stuff. Like I said, you can get back XML or JSON. I prefer JSON, but in PowerShell, it's really just kind of depends on what you like working with. To specify what you want, you just add a header, the accept header. You're going to specify either application/Atom XML or application/JSON. OData equals either verbose, minimal metadata, or no metadata. Most people just use verbose because a lot of the documentation that's out there has verbose. This is because minimal metadata and no metadata was only recently introduced within the last, I don't know, 6 months or whatever it was. It might have been last August, actually, so a little longer. So that's basically OData 3 light support. So getting connected and actually working with this is going to be reasonably similar to the process for CSOM. You're going to get a credential. And I like to use the SharePoint Online credentials object to actually establish the credential. You don't need to do this, but it is a fair bit of code if you want to eliminate those dependencies. So one nice thing about REST is you can actually eliminate all dependencies to any assemblies like the client object assemblies. You don't technically have to use them, but if you don't use them, then you've got to handle the negotiation with the online authentication provider to actually get the secure token that you need. I've got an article that I've written that will be posted hopefully within the next week on IT Unity that covers how to do that. So I've got a method I'll show here in a minute that kind of wraps all this up for you so that I can just call one method to get connected and execute my query. And I have an alternative method that will be in that article that removes the dependency to the online commandlet assemblies, rather. Once I've got my credentials, I'm going to create a SystemNet web request object and just pass in the URL that I want to connect to. So what is that URL is my REST endpoint, right? So I don't care about site collection or whatever, just what is the endpoint that you're connecting to. So in this example, it would be this guy here at the bottom, right? Okay. And then you would set your credential object. Again, this is something you would do for every single request, which is why most people have extracted all this into some sort of helper method. Once you want to make the call, there's a couple other properties you need to set. Your header, accept header. So again, do you want XML or JSON back? And then you need to add a header called xforms based auth accepted. If I recall the value, the F there doesn't actually matter what you put, but that is required to be there. And then you might optionally need a request digest, an if match header, an XHTTP method. These are relevant when you're submitting data, like you're going to create a list or something. When I call that get response, that actually triggers the call. I'm going to get a response object, and then I get a stream reader. So the data that comes back comes back in the form of a stream, and I use the get response stream method to actually retrieve it. Reader.read to end, that gives me the data. So this is basically going to be a string that comes back, unless I'm downloading a file, in which case it'll be a byte array. There's this cool commandlet called convertFrom-JSON. I can pass that string into it, and it'll give me a PS custom object. So this is an object that will look like any other .NET object in PowerShell. So I can operate on it with properties and everything. So there's no methods, but at least gives me those properties. And like the CSOM examples, there's a lot of REST examples as well that you can see online. And I'll just show you really quick here. I've got this helper method called invoke SPO REST method, and it does a whole mess of stuff for you. It abstracts out all this connection stuff. So again, like the CSOM one, I'm establishing a connection up here in the begin process. And then I'm just going and setting up all the different variables, headers, all that stuff for you in here. And I'm handling things like the if match, the XHTTP method, so everything that you can do to it. And then I get that response back and dump it out as an object. And if we look at some examples here, so let me just load these guys. Okay.
Do they throttle the REST API as well?
What's that?
Do they throttle the REST calls as well?
I'm not sure. I think so. I want to say they do, but I don't remember, honestly. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to retrieve back a list. So I'm just executing that method and passing in an URL to this endpoint. This is going to return back the documents library. And if I look in, I think I still have, I guess I closed Fiddler. There it is. So if I come down to here and where'd it go? Yeah, so this is the Fiddler data that comes back for that. So you can see it returns back a lot of data. You'll want to use this a lot because there's no way for me to know necessarily what data is coming back and whatnot. Well, I can see the values coming back, but when I'm working with this, sometimes you want to know what are the additional properties, what didn't get populated, that kind of stuff. But if I dump this out, I can see the results there. And you can see it just looks like any other PowerShell object. Now everything with deferred says it didn't load that. Now I'll need to go ahead and grab that myself. So, if I'm creating a new list, again, it's just calling that invoke SPO REST method function that I created. I need to get some context information. So this is my form digest, that first line here, right here. So I need this in order to create the list, because you need that form digest to basically, it prevents certain types of security attacks. So if you don't have that there, it's going to give you a warning about you need to refresh the browser or something silly like that. But all these examples that I've got, as far as the data that you provide in here, so your structure of your body tag, you can find all these out on MSDN and lots of examples. Most of them are not going to be specific to PowerShell, but it's nothing to convert that example and just put it in a string here and then pass it into a function like this. So again, the articles that I've got coming out soon will go ahead and detail all of this. All right, so just to wrap up, let me talk really quickly about this. I'm out of time. A lot of the issues that I showed, like with the client context objects, the CSOM objects, and when you're working with them and knowing what properties are initialized and what isn't initialized and whatnot, that was one of the reasons why I created my own custom commandlets. So these are not just commandlets. There's a lot of them. I can come out to here and see the list of them on my site. So if you go to my blog and go to the command index, you can see them there. So there's currently 45 of them, but it allows me to do things like get and create lists, content types. I can add web parts to pages, folders, export, import the term stores, a whole mess of stuff there. But all the objects that I return back are wrappers to the ones that Microsoft provides, so that when I do something like this, let me get my credential objects here. And if I retrieve a list object and output the details for that, I get no errors about an object not being initialized or whatever. So I'm going ahead and checking, is this object initialized? If not, then don't output the property. So I've taken most of the objects that we get as part of the CSOM API and wrapped them in a custom object so that I can work on it very similarly to how I would on-prem. So here, if I want to create a new list, I just go ahead and get my web object, create my list, update my title, update the list. So this code looks almost identical to what you would do on-prem. So there's no execute query, no load, none of that crap. I kind of abstract all those details away. So in terms of trying to work with the commandlets and the API in PowerShell, this becomes a lot more intuitive, because then you don't have to think asynchronously. So the downside is the batching benefits are gone if you do this, because I'm assuming these are single operations and whatnot. So I'm performing and executing, it. But I do expose all of those, the client, the CSOM object. So if I do list.list, this will give me the actual CSOM object. And you can see here there's properties that aren't initialized, so you can't get to it. But I can work with my commandlets where it makes sense, and then jump into the underlying object where maybe I need to do some batching type stuff. So again, you can download those from my blog. For me, it just makes things a lot easier. That invoke SPO REST function that I showed in terms of script, I also have as a commandlet. So if you download those, you get them automatically. And the source is available. So I make sure that, I'm a big fan of, if you download something from the internet, make sure you understand what it's doing. Don't just blindly run code. So anything that I put out there, if it's compiled, I also put the source code. I might eventually move these over to GitHub, but right now they're just there as a Visual Studio project that you can download from my site. So, all right, that's it. I'm out of time. So sorry I went over.